The Boston Celtics defeated Indiana in Game 4 of the Eastern Conference Finals, with Jaylen Brown winning the Conference Finals MVP. In the series preceding this one, they would lose just one game in each, both of those games being the result of some extreme shooting variance. But unless their opponent was hot or just executing flawlessly for most of the game, Boston didn't have any issue with the teams they faced on their road to the finals. The three best teams in the conference after the Celtics, they managed to avoid facing entirely, those teams being the Sixers, Knicks, and Bucks. As a result, there has been some questioning of the legitimacy of this run. Not just doubting if it's even an accomplishment in the first place, but also suggesting it may mean that this team is not ready for the NBA Finals. Hello everybody, welcome to Also Rusty Buckets. If you are on YouTube and you have not already, please be sure to subscribe to this channel. We are trying to hit 200K by the end of the year. Also go check us out on Spotify if you want this as an audio-only experience. That will be the top link in the description. Give us a follow, give us a 5-star, you know the drill. Okay, first things first. I just want to make it clear that talking about a narrative does not mean that I endorse that narrative, as so many people who comment on the videos seem to think. I am going to be discussing a very commonly put out there perspective. We're going to look at it from every angle possible and see if there's legitimacy to it. Now, I'm not even sure what my actual take is, and we're just kind of going to work our way through it as I talk it out, but I don't necessarily think this is the fairest criticism. So, bear that in mind. Though I do think it's actually important to recognize that this is not entirely a narrative thing. Like, for the most part, this stuff is mostly inconsequential in terms of the actual result on the floor. But what a lot of people have suggested is that Boston might not be ready for this finals because of the lack of series that were tough that they played before it. So just to make this simple, let me first start with the case against Boston before we talk about some flaws with this narrative. Generally, through most finals runs, you're going to have at least one, likely two series that you play where it looks like your opponent at least has a decent shot. And pretty much every series that Boston got, they were not only heavily favored, they were heavily favored to win in 4 or 5 games, which they did every time. It doesn't always work out this way to where your opponents are progressively more difficult, but generally you kind of want it to be like a video game where, like, as you go by each level, it gets a little bit more difficult so that you are hardened and battle tested by the time you get to the final boss. But some teams are also just dominant like that, and regardless of how much you want to criticize their competition, I also feel like Boston could have been this dominant regardless of who they faced, and I don't know, it is a problem, I think, to a degree, that they didn't have any real adversity. There was a Game 1 versus Indiana that went to overtime in the conference finals. That's about it. The only games that they lost, there was shooting variance stuff, like for Miami, they shot insanely well from outside. I think they hit 19, 20 3-pointers. I will say that Celtics defense in that game was kind of bad on the 3-point line, so that's partially to blame for the quality of looks that they got, but they were still hitting shots that they shouldn't have normally. And in Game 2 versus Cleveland, apparently they love losing Game 2s on shooting variance because the Cavs shot 48% from 3 while Boston shot just 23%. Regardless of those games though, otherwise they went 12-2. And they outscored their opponents by an average of 14.6 points per game. That's a lot. That's a really, really large average margin of victory. And I imagine you take out those losses, the average margin of victory gets even more nuts. So it's quite a dominant display. But on the flip side, you know, getting more towards some defensive Boston, what were they necessarily supposed to do? Because all that they could do given this context was kick the asses of the teams that they faced. I'm sure they're not necessarily having a problem with a cakewalk to the finals, but I also don't know that we need to assign some morality to this as though it was up to them. I think it's kind of similar to when people criticize players for being overpaid, or they, criticize players for decisions that were made by the front office, essentially. It's that same kind of thing. It's is it actually their fault though? And the answer is unequivocally no. None of this is their fault. They're not the reason why the playoffs went the way that they did. They're not the reason why the matchups went the way that they did. It's just kind of how it happened. Injuries played a huge factor, not only in that Miami Heat series, but there were some key injuries in the Cavs series, and the reason they faced the Pacers to begin with instead of a New York Knicks team that I think had a much better shot of bothering them was because of injuries. So that is true. Also worth mentioning though, Boston is missing who I think is their second best player, and most people would say is their third best player, that being Kristaps Porzingis. Played the first couple of games of that Miami Heat series, and then he got hurt. He was good outside of one game where he shot 1 for 9 of those games. And honestly, if I was going to make any argument in favor of Boston, I'd probably lead with that. Like, okay, these teams were missing Jarrett Allen for some games, and obviously Jimmy Butler missing is absolutely huge, but other than that, like, Indiana was mostly healthy. They were missing their second best or third best player, and they still managed to dominate. They kind of did what they were supposed to do across the board. It's even worth mentioning that not having him for the last 8 games, I just think makes them a significantly worse team. And honestly, any instance in which the opponent actually looked scary to them, again, specifically calling back to that game 1, I was thinking, man, this wouldn't happen if Porzingis was here. On both ends of the floor, the defense that he provides, the offensive versatility that he provides that this team desperately needs. His offensive versatility is frankly the reason that you trade for him and give up Marcus Smart in the process, because Marcus Smart kind of has the same bad shot-taking tendencies that Tatum and Brown do, where Porzingis is more efficient with his decision-making, doesn't shoot the ball inappropriately often. Sometimes he takes really deep bombs where it's like, should you really be taking that, Kristaps? But other than that, such a huge factor for them. But because of the ease of their finals run, other than Porzingis, they're really not beat up at all, and they're not really depleted on energy. You can't necessarily say that Dallas had some super tedious finals run, like the OKC series and Clippers series were both 6 games. Conference finals ended up being 5, though I will mention 4 out of those 5 games were extremely competitive and, extremely a grind to win. So that is a factor here. It is more tedium than was faced by the Celtics. There were more instances in which it looked like this team might lose. There were even many people who favored the Timberwolves over Dallas. I personally picked Dallas to win if Luka was healthy, and he was, but I also picked it to go 6 or 7 in that context, and it went 5, so they were even better than I anticipated. Didn't think Minnesota was going to roll over quite the way that they did. But either way, Dallas not super battle-tested either, but significantly more so than the Celtics. There were multiple instances throughout these playoffs where it looked like they might actually lose the series that they were in. Frankly, probably an instance of that in the first 2 series a couple of times, given that they did lose 2 games. I believe there might have been a time where one team even went up 2-1, if I'm not mistaken, but I definitely could be. Calling back to this general narrative, like in many areas with the NBA, I think the truth lies in the middle. I think that is where the reality is. There's really one thing that I was watching for with Boston through this entire postseason run, and that was their Achilles heel. The one thing that consistently comes up and leaves them short of the finish line when they did everything else right, and that is execution in the clutch, specifically Jason Tatum, and whether or not they even play down to their competition, because that's another thing where they lose to opponents that they have no business losing to. So knowing these matchups, is Boston going to play down to its competition? Well, they didn't. Are they going to perform well in the clutch? Well, they did. This is something that's been discussed with the Celtics time and time again, and I think really the reason for that is it is the most glaring issue for a team that is otherwise pretty perfect. I feel like the Celtics, the entire Tatum-Jalen tenure, they have consistently represented almost being good enough. over and over and over and over again, almost being good enough. And the margin in which they end up not being quite good enough is regularly in their execution, regularly in their ability to not or to blow leads rather. So not doing that is huge. And throughout this run, given weak competition, didn't play down to that competition. The only games they lost, they played about as well as they could have, other than defending the 3-point line in that one Heat game. But besides for that, pretty much universally, they did not play down to their competition. They smacked their opponents every time that they could. They buried them every time that they could. They did not take their foot off of the gas every time that they could. And Jason Tatum specifically was clutch throughout these playoffs. And that is specifically the fourth quarter, because he was actually kind of bad in the first 3 quarters of most of the games of the first 2 rounds. Wasn't amazing necessarily versus Indiana the whole way through, which is why Jalen ended up winning the conference finals MVP. But I digress. The point is, Tatum executed well late. Just the best example, obviously, is this. There's not that many games where they actually were in the clutch, given the average deficit of 14.6. But in those handful of games, Tatum did execute flawlessly. Specifically, Game 1 versus Indiana, after Aaron Nesmith fouled out, who was Tatum's primary matchup and really the only guy on the Pacers who had much of a chance of defending Tatum. After he fouled out, Rick Carlisle made a boneheaded decision by subbing in TJ McConnell alongside Aaron Nesmith and Halliburton, meaning you had a 3-guard lineup, and defensively, that is just food, and Jason Tatum recognized that, and he didn't do something that I regularly feel like he does, which is settle for jump shots, especially mid-range jump shots that maybe he can hit, but you could have got a better look, put better pressure on the defense, got them in rotation, got a better shot, maybe got to the free throw line, whatever that may be. Sometimes I feel like Tatum struggles to actually put pressure on the defense, even if he hits that shot every once in a while. But he was specifically attacking Nembhard in the post, who became his primary matchup because he's the only good defender of those 3 guards. He would immediately get an and one on TJ McConnell. He then ran some screen action at the top of the key where he took a pull-up 3-pointer, which, yes, is a jump shot, but A, it's worth an extra point, and B, the tiny-ass guard, I think it was TJ McConnell on the switch off of the screen, contesting that shot might as well not be there. Like, that's as easy of a pull-up as with technically a contest as you're going to get. It was just smart execution. They played basketball under pressure in the conference finals the right way. Now, mind you, you are heavily favored in this series, but I also feel like that's a pressure that Boston has struggled with in the past. Being heavily favored seems to make them play down to that competition, as I mentioned. In the case of that Game 1, I really feel like Indiana was having an excellent game, and that wasn't really the fault of the Celtics. They didn't really execute well until that fourth quarter and overtime in the case of Boston, but they still were not doing bad. There was no blatant boneheaded decisions. I don't know, the pressure didn't get to them. I never really saw the pressure get to them, and that was the thing I was fearful of in the past. For what it's worth, this Celtics roster is very different. I think we get lost on that very often, that Derek White, Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, and Al Horford, I believe, are the only rotational guys who are returned. Or is Sam Hauser? Sam Hauser might have been on the team the year before, but I don't think he was a regular rotation guy. Technically, Luke Cornett has played as well, and he was there, but that's just because Kristaps is out. Otherwise, he wouldn't be. So, yeah, we've seen Boston crack under pressure, but they didn't. If anything, I feel like they mostly thrived in it. But they did still ultimately thrive in it against fairly unimpressive teams. Miami without Jimmy, Cleveland without Jarrett Allen and Mitchell for 2 games, Indiana without Halliburton for 2 games. Indiana being a team that was really only there, again, because they faced an injured opponent. It's not that Boston's run is illegitimate or you should be super fearful because of things outside of their control. I don't really think that's a fair criticism so much as it could just be an abject reality to consider. It's more that it's just not all that convincing due to the context. some people don't exactly have an idea of what to expect from Boston going into the finals, which usually you have a good notion of that going into it, because it's really hard to compare what they did in the first 3 rounds to what they could theoretically do against Dallas, because Dallas is just so much better than any other team that Boston has faced. So the question is, does this dominance in the regular season and this dominance against some fairly cakewalk opponents, does that translate to dominance on the larger stage, or do they need to warm up first and they haven't done that? Usually, we have at least some information to go on in terms of how a team will perform in the finals, how they handle matchup switching, how they handle different personnel. In reality, for Boston, it just didn't seem to matter what they did. It didn't even really seem like they made that many adjustments because they were never forced to. I don't feel like Boston made an adjustment this entire fucking postseason, at least nothing that's that dramatically noteworthy, because there was nothing that they needed to do to be better than their opponent. There's usually enough of a sample size, there's usually enough of a concrete idea of how they perform in the clutch and under pressure. Dun, 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 dun. But we don't have that here. Now, as for the claim that this is the easiest finals run ever, I know there was one from the 80s with the Lakers that people have talked about, but at least in terms of something that I witnessed as an NBA fan live in my lifetime, I gotta say this is the easiest finals run I've ever seen. It's at least up there, for sure. But from what I have seen, it's undoubtedly the biggest, the easiest. The last I can think, like the conference finals matchup, I immediately thought of the Atlanta Hawks when the Pacers were in there versus the Milwaukee Bucks. But the Atlanta Hawks actually were better than the Pacers, I think. Their run made a little bit more sense, and they defeated a fully healthy Sixers team. Granted, Ben Simmons kind of threw it, as did Joel Embiid, with an not so great Game 7. But even then, they gave Milwaukee some trouble. Part of that because Giannis missed some time. Did he miss the whole series? I don't think he did, though. I don't think so. At least they faced a Miami Heat team that theoretically could have beat them. They didn't. They got fucking dog walked, but they could have. They played the Nets, where that series went to 7, and they probably would have lost if not for some key injuries. So, the reason that a not great team made the conference finals in the Atlanta Hawks was because they managed to beat a team that choked. And I don't know, I just think they were a little bit better of a team. And Milwaukee on that finals run had a Game 7 to get there. So it's more impressive than, what this was for Boston. I don't know, I just don't think it's that impressive. It really isn't, especially by contrast to how much of a bloodbath the Western Conference has been. I'm not saying the Celtics couldn't have made it out of the West, theoretically. They didn't have to deal with that adversity. They had a pretty easy experience. And do I think this lack of experience and pressure earlier on will hurt them in the finals? I would say to some degree, yes. By no means do I think it's by some large margin. Do I think it's enough to cause them to lose the series? I wouldn't guess so, but I do think it's possible. It's kind of dependent on a variety of factors from Dallas, because if they put the right pressure on, we could see them crack under it, but they might not necessarily put the right pressure on. And maybe the series is close enough either way, so then the fact that they could crack under some pressure ends up defining it, which is kind of what's happened with the Celtics in general, is they look like they have no reason to lose, and then they kind of just let it slip once their opponent presents even a little bit of a challenge. I also think that they will benefit health-wise. I think Porzingis can come back and get in decent shape given the time that they have off. There's less fatigue on their bodies, which is a huge help. They're not going to get burnt out as easily as the series goes along. This whole thing's just an interesting paradigm. I don't really fully have a strong opinion on the matter, but it's something that people are talking about. And I think there's a lot of discussion to be had about the Celtics in general and Jason Tatum in general. There's been a lot of people talking on Twitter and in general, I said in general so much there, about like Tatum and the Celtics and how people talk about them. Do we talk about them the same way we would other teams? And honestly, I think a lot of this criticism is disingenuous or just cope. Because frankly, Boston has had multiple opportunities to do better than they have throughout the last couple of years, and they fell short. That is an abject reality, and I'm tired of pretending like it's not. I am tired of people acting like that's an unfair criticism, because it's not. But it's also not as fair of a criticism as it used to be now that they have pretty fundamentally changed their core. Drew Holiday and Porzingis being there dramatically changes things, both in terms of the construction of the roster and in terms of the clutch factor of it all. I don't know that either of them are necessarily clutch players, but they are better overall offensive players, more capable of putting better pressure on the defense than Marcus Smart and Robert Williams were capable of in the past. So I don't think it's necessarily a fair comparison to go, well, the Celtics in 2018 or the Celtics in 2021 or 2022 in the NBA Finals, they did this or that. It's not necessarily all that relevant, but it's not unrelevant because there are some core pieces who did indeed do those things. So my overall verdict, yeah, Boston had one of the easiest playoff runs ever. Do I think it's going to cause them to lose the series? No. Do I think it will have a tangible, noticeable effect to some degree? Yes. Do I think it could affect the results of the series? Yes, but only under fairly extreme circumstances. So ultimately, probably none of this matters, and it's all just hating on the Celtics. But I will say this. If I was a Celtics fan, but if I was a Celtics fan, I would just embrace the hate. I feel like there is nothing else you can do, and honestly, I don't know why Boston doesn't do it more, because I feel like in general they have a similar attitude and, at least fair or not, reputation as sports fans for being similar to like Philadelphia, for example. But I feel like with Philly, they embrace the fact that everyone hates them. I mean, sure, there's still a bunch of people on Twitter who bitch and moan about it because that's just the way it's always going to be. But for the most part, they're like, yeah, everyone's against us, whatever. People are always going to root against the Celtics. They always will. I'm going to root against the Celtics because I like the Mavericks a lot more. In 2022, in that finals run, I was actually rooting for the Celtics in that finals just because, I mean, even though I'm a Steph fan, I just find it more interesting when a new team wins a series. And I will not have any problem with Boston winning. I would just find more enjoyment in the Mavericks winning. Yeah, I mean, you're just always going to be hated. And is that a little unfair to the players like Jason Tatum? Sure. I feel like the exact problem with Jason Tatum is that he's not quite a top 5 guy. And he probably never will quite be either. He is in a very similar place to Paul Pierce, ironically. I remember in a Hot Takes video, someone said, Paul Pierce and Tatum actually have a lot of parallels in their career. That's absolutely, unabashedly, undoubtedly true. Well, for sure, that is true. Paul Pierce was pretty much like the 7th or 8th, maybe 6th at best player in the NBA during his tenure at his absolute peak. Same could be said for Jason Tatum. He's a superstar, but barely. And that is the difference between being there's a difference between being an undeniable superstar and is Tatum going to play like a superstar today, or is he going to kind of shit the bed? And he kind of flip-flops back and forth between either one, and I think because he's on an otherwise remarkably dominant team and the Celtics are very forward-facing, it results in him being a more prominently put out there face, despite the fact that there are multiple players, not a lot, but a light handful that are better basketball players. And I think a lot of people will look at an excellent core around the 7th best player in the NBA and go, man, I wish the first or 3rd or 4th or 5th best player in the NBA had that lineup. It'd be cool if Luka managed to have the help that Tatum did throughout the past couple of years. And damn well he'd have a title if he did. I don't know, that's the difference. That's what it always comes down to, is Tatum's just not quite as good as the Giannis's, the Lukas, and the Jokic's, but he is also more prominent than any of them in terms of the league discussion because of Boston. And also the other thing is front running, which I don't know if that's necessarily fair because it is just criticizing you for having help. But there is some degree of truth to, Tatum can have a bad game and they can still win. That's not so much the case for a lot of the other best players in the NBA. But yeah, I've talked about this shit enough. Shout out to Nick for editing this video. Hopefully the comment section is not a war zone, but that is it. Goodbye.